Good afternoon. I'd like to take a few minutes to talk a little bit about the binding of Isaac, and I appreciate all the comments that came through, all very, very thoughtful. So I'm going to share a few comments. So a lot of you responded in a very sort of traditional rabbinic way. Rabbi Soloveitchik, 20th century Orthodox rabbi. And so this is what he says, which is very similar to what some of you said. Akeda is the Hebrew for binding. So man, that's his word, is a servant of God. He belongs completely to God, body and soul. Hence, God from time to time calls upon man to return to him whatever is his. He demands that man give not a part, but the whole of himself. Of course, the idea of sacrifice is a cornerstone of Judaism, and the Akeda has inevitably introduced sacrificial action as a part of our historical drama. Abraham implemented the sacrifice of Isaac, not on Mount Moriah, but in the depth of his heart. He gave up Isaac the very instant God addresses himself to him and asked him to return his most precious possession to its legitimate master and owner. Okay, so yes, there was this concept, and this is what some of the early rabbis have to say, that, Abraham is the, exemplar of faith. He has faith in God, whether it's that God is asking him something that he may not understand, but that he must do, or that somehow God will see to it in the end that it's all going to be okay. I'd like to sort of toss out that that's also a very Christian view. The idea that we have faith in God, and as long as we have faith in God, it's all going to be okay. But let me ask you a question. Have you noticed that that's how life works? That you have faith in God, you follow God, and everything's okay? I don't think so. And Brandon brought up the issue of Job last week, because after all, we can do everything right. We can be the best people we can even ever think of. And yet horrible things can happen to us. So frankly, my view of God is not one like that, because if I just trust in God and say, whatever, how do I explain the fact that my mother was in Auschwitz? So I'm not saying you should abandon that concept. If that's a concept that works for you, that's great. But I got to tell you that I don't think it's completely a Jewish approach, even though, yes, that's what Rav Soloveitchik says. That's what some of the early rabbis say. But very quickly, you get something else. Now, this is Bereshit Rabbah, which is a collection of Midrash, as you can see, between 300 and 500 CE. There's already an element of doubt here. So they're quoting somebody, Yishai. And you have to understand that in Hebrew, and the way the rabbis understand the Torah is by taking the Hebrew and playing with the words, because in the Torah, there are no vowels. So if you look at the consonants, you can play around with what the meaning of a word is, even with a vowel, with a consonant that sometimes is read one way or another, depending on where the dot is, but there's no dot in the Torah. So the brilliant idea of Yishai is that when God says to Abraham that he has not withheld Isaac from him, because that's at the end, the conclusion is, you did not withhold your son from me, therefore I'm going to reward you. So in Hebrew, that's lo hasachta et bincha. So they're rereading it to say lo hashachta, which is a very similar word, but as you can see, instead of an S sound, hasachta, it's lo hashachta. And when you change, and that's in Hebrew, the letter is a shin or a sin. So it looks exactly the same. It just depends on where you put the dot. So when it says lo hashachta et bincha, it completely changes the meaning of the word. And so, as they say, you're replacing a sin with a shin. And what that means is you did not kill your son. That's why I'm rewarding you, because you did not kill your son. Now, I believe it was Suzanne who noticed that the name for God, when Abraham is told not to kill his son, is a different name from the one that told him to kill his son, leading one to wonder, Was it two different versions that got smushed together? Was it a different aspect of God that comes out and says, don't do this? Was it the right, right message from God that he finally heard at the end? So here you already have some doubt here. And this is, early rabbis, right? You didn't, we didn't read it right. It's not lo hasachta. It's not that you withheld your son. It's that you didn't kill him that makes me happy. Here's another one from Bereshit Rabbah. And again, unfortunately, without knowing Hebrew, it's a little hard to completely understand what they do here. But when the angel tells Abraham not to slay his son, Abraham wonders, surely you're indulging in prevarication. This is Abraham talking to God. Yesterday you said, for in Isaac your seed shall be called. So in other words, hey, Abraham says to God, you told me my seed was going to be really, plentiful. And this is my only son. So how's that possible? You made me one promise and now you're saying, take your son. And now you're changing your mind again. You're saying, don't do it. I'm confused. The Holy One says to him, Abraham, I did not mess up this covenant. I will not profane my covenant. And I'm going to establish my covenant with Isaac. So he says, when I asked you, take now your son, he says, take your son for an olah. An olah is a burnt offering. No question about that. There is no question. But again, they're going to reread it by just changing the vowels. Did I tell you to slaughter him and make him into a burnt offering? No, I told you to take him up. It's the same consonants with different vowels. Now take him down. In other words, you didn't hear me right, which I think is a very important idea here, which is, did Abraham really hear God? Or did he hear his own inner voice saying, hey, you know what? Prove what a great pious man you are. So the test is maybe a test of whether Abraham hears the right voice. Maybe it's even a test of God. Here's Harold Schulweis. This might shock you. Harold Schulweis was a conservative rabbi in Encino at Valley Beth Shalom. And he says, I understand the need for the absolute and for the unconditional authority. So the absolute and the unconditional authority are what some of you interpreted this to be. God's the ultimate authority. We listen no matter what, and it's all going to be okay. Just think for a second about jihadists or other fanatics. They think they hear God telling them to do this. Baruch Goldstein, who was a very Orthodox Israeli, went and killed a whole bunch of, Palestinians at the cave where supposedly Abraham and Sarah were buried because that's what God told him to do. Is that really the voice of God? What Harold Schulweis says, okay, yes, I cannot deny that it frightens me and appalls me. He's talking about the story. It offends me. And I know that I cannot possibly relate to such a God. A God who would ask us to do this is not God. Simply put, because to accept obedience is the end all, to surrender my critical moral intelligence before the voice is to open oneself up. I'm sorry, I didn't read that well. Simply put, because to accept obedience as the end all, to surrender my critical moral intelligence before the voice is to open oneself up to fanaticism, to terror, to the justification of any kind of violence. There are times when to obey the voice of God is blasphemy. For the punitive voice of God balances the voice of conscience to make a mockery of faith. An act of goodness is not good because God commanded it, but God commanded it because it is good. In other words, if it's something awful, it couldn't be God commanding that. And that's why God gave us a conscience and reasoning and the ability to tell right from wrong. Now, that doesn't mean things are always clear by any means, but we're not supposed to surrender our critical faculty. So let's just take a couple of minutes to talk about this. We could spend an entire month talking a year talking about the Akedah. It's a very complicated story. But I do, I mean, I don't want people to, have to give up their faith. But I just do want you to think a little bit about the story in a slightly more critical way. Because again, we don't take things literally in Judaism. There's a whole tradition of really questioning. Oh, there's one more that I want to show you, actually. So we have all these various men who are commentators who's going to talk about it. But what about the women? What about the Sarahs who have their son taken off and are going to be sent to slaughter for sacrifice, whatever? And there are a lot of women who've written poetry about this to say, no, this is not okay. And what I want to share with you is a piece by Rabbi Zoe Klein, who is a rabbi in West Los Angeles. Akedat Yitzhak again is the binding of Isaac. Take your son, your precious one, and offer him up as a burnt offering. Children, how many children are to be sacrificed on altars to false gods? How many children to be strapped with explosives, to be schooled over stockpiles of weapons? How many children to be bound to the altar of selfish agendas, offered up as burnt offerings? Children of the Yazidi community pulled into the desert mountains of Iraq, pushed off the sides of cliffs by parents who could not bear to watch them starve. How many children to be burnt offerings? How many children to be bound to the beds of terrorists, raped for the rest of their lives for learning to read? Take your daughter, your precious one, and offer her up as a burnt offering. How many children are to be sacrificed on altars of corruption? Journalists, humanitarians beheaded before the idols of money and power. How many children gunned down by police, by firearms? Oh God, the lions are eating our lambs. Take our sons, our precious ones, and cuddle them in quilts. Take our daughters, our precious ones, and cradle them in comforters. God said to Abraham, take your son, your precious one, and offer him up as a burnt offering. And I say, no. So she's expanding this beyond the story in the Torah to all the ways in which we sacrifice our children, with all the best motives sometimes for various reasons. And, no. So I'd just like to see if there's some responses to these sort of deeper questions. Obviously, there are a couple of people who did pose some tougher questions about the story. But I just want to caution us against being too fanatic about just following the so-called path of God, because we are interpreting what we think is the path of God. If God actually showed up in front of us and said, do this or do that, that would be different. But it's always coming through our interpretation, our consciousness. And so if we say, God told me to do this, well, let's really think about it. And the Torah, again, was written by human beings. This is how they understood God. Maybe they really thought this was something that should be done. But we just never leave it just at that. Beverly, go ahead.
Oh my God. Well, Bobby and I were just talking about this because so much of homophobia is based on God. This is what God told me to do. And Suzanne, I remember a conversation that I had with my father when I was sobbing. And I said, how could you believe in a God who would turn you against your own children? And I couldn't understand it. And it's a similar thing, you
Yes.
know, it's that conception of God that he couldn't get past it, even for his own children. I think it's incredible.
And I would refer you once again to Harold Schulweis, who gave a wonderful talk at Hebrew Union College when I was a student there, basically saying, if it's immoral, God did not
Mhm.
tell you to do this. And again, we do not take what is in the Bible literally without some, ability to discern, is this really God or isn't it? I'm not saying we shouldn't believe in God, have faith in God, follow God, whatever, but let's figure out if we're listening to the right voice. I had mentioned Leonard Cohen last time, and if you want to look up, he's got this great song called The Story of Isaac. Clearly, the guy heard the wrong voice.
Yeah.
Doug.
So I found it interesting that, from so many different perspectives, but I have several friends in Israel, Orthodox and conservative, and in the U.S. as well. But it's interesting. Things will pop up on posts, and I think that this week a couple of things had popped up that I found to be interesting as it relates to faith, because there are times, and you started with some, from a slightly different Christian perspective and how faith plays out differently within Christianity. And I'm the first person to say I actually, probably many more people understand Christianity better than I do. So I don't have a good grounding in Christianity, but I find so much when it comes to the concept of faith that there are times, and I listen to some of my more Orthodox or my Orthodox friends in Israel, especially as it relates to situations that are happening in Israel right now, whether it comes to the settlement of different territories or different sections within Palestine or within the Palestinian zones, as it comes to COVID vaccinations, which I know is not what topic is about, yet I still come across concepts of faith where it absolutely says, but if you follow, if you move forward, if you do what we were commanded to do and you have faith, then we should be doing this. And that to me is no different than the Catholic Church or other organizations saying move forward with the Crusades to go ahead and bring Jerusalem and the Holy Land back to the church, or take the Jews that you've been working with on your side of the Rhine and take them back, and push them back out, or expel them, or remove them, or anything else that has wound up happening in the name of any religion, in the name of faith or fanaticism. What voice were you listening to? Was it really Hashem, or was it really something else that was going through your head because somebody mentioned something to you down the street one day, and all of a sudden it got stuck in your head, and now you think it's Hashem's voice and it's actually somebody else's voice that's in your head? Or when you're impressionable and you're young and you're told over and over again that this is how you should have faith and this is how you should believe, and that winds up dictating and moving your actions in the future. And then you have what ultimately winds up happening, whether it's with women and how women wind up working within this, or our LGBTQ community, or anybody else. Whose faith is that? Who are you listening to? Right, because if for most people, if you really, and within a Christian section, I know several of my Christian friends talk about, if you have your heart open, then God will come put something in your heart. And then you need to listen to what's been put in your heart. But lots of people are putting things in your heart. And I'm going to get off my soapbox. Love y'all.
Thank you. Thank you, Doug. Thank you. Again, I just, the reason I said it was kind of Christian to me is because, and I'm not an expert in Christian theology by any means either, but the prioritizing of faith. Again, it's not to say that Jews don't believe in God. I mean, that's supposed to be the sine qua non of, your religion, is that there's one God. But the faith issue is not quite the same. The faith issue is more, it's really almost secondary. It's your behavior. And so someone like Harold Schulweis is going to say, you know what, if this, entails behavior that is, seriously problematic, then maybe you need to rethink it. Okay, Brandon.
The one thing I wanted to add, I had a discussion with my brother about Catholicism and Judaism, but the very skinny of it is I was telling him that Judaism is more about your actions within your community and building up the community of mankind. So it is still possible to adhere to these Jewish principles and be Catholic, because he's adhering to Catholicism. And I told him that it is possible to do both, because Judaism is about being a good person and building a good community. And that's what the mitzvot are about. It is about building the community of mankind together.
Right. Now, Reverend Linda Brown has her hand raised, and we do want to hear from you. She's a pastor, and she knows way more about Christianity than I do. So go ahead, Linda. I'm very curious to hear your point of view.
Well, I'm really, open to hearing all this and very interested. My question is, where would Judaism, what part does the ram in the thicket play for Judaism that showed up before Abraham was just ready to do Isaac in?
Well, actually, the tradition says that the ram was created on the, like 6th day. Like on the 6th day of creation, there were a whole bunch of things that were created, and that's one of them. It's sort of, there to save Abraham from himself almost. Notice that they have to, the angel has to say Abraham, Abraham twice. He's so possessed by this idea that he goes ahead and, raises the knife and is about to plunge it. But yeah, the ram is just, the actual sacrifice that maybe, when Abraham says to his son, God will provide, he's either lying to his son or he knows that God will provide, but it doesn't have a significance beyond that, I don't think. Why?
I was just wondering, because
Yeah.
since it's a rather, I guess from a Christian perspective, it's a rather important part of the story. I was just wondering where Judaism.
You mean that God did provide for Abraham?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, if you go the route of, utter faith in God, well, God, made sure at the end that it wasn't going to happen. But even if he doesn't kill his kid, just think about the trauma that this kid is going to be living with for the rest of his life in, pursuit of his father's fanaticism. The kid was almost murdered by his father. He was bound up. The knife was up here, All right, let's take one more comment, and then we're going to move on to Purim. All right, 2 more comments. Shay and then Bobby.
Yeah, the story in just growing up in Christianity for myself, and I can only give it from my perspective, what I love about Judaism and Reformed is the opportunity to question, because so many years in church, even when things would happen in real time, it was like, let's just wait and see what God does with the situation, and not really able to question anything, in the Black church. And it's taken so literal, and then it's just like, you accept what you're given, and it is what it is. And there's this futuristic sense of like, not worrying about the earth as it is right now, but what it will be in the future. And you live within your environment and take it as is, and aren't able to see change currently because you just kind of lay it in God's hands. Well, God will take care of it. It will work itself out. But, things wouldn't have evolved if we had that kind of attitude with, let's say, racism or slavery or things of the past, and that's something I think the beauty that I'm seeing in Judaism is the fact of making change for now. So I just wanted to add that, and what I liked.
And notice it's not just Reform Jews who've questioned the story. You got rabbis from way back kind of going, there's something wrong with this. But it's complicated. And as I said, we could spend a lot of time on it. I have so many different interpretations. I only threw out a few of them at you. And, one of the interpretations has been it's a way to show that you shouldn't be sacrificing your children, because that's what some of the cultures around there did. But again, the kid was on the altar and he almost got slaughtered. So, all right, Bobby.
I'm just really thankful for all of this, the last, whatever it is, 25 minutes, because it's helping me to understand. I've been so upset about, Trump followers, fanaticism, the whole thing. And if you think about faith and what's underneath faith, it's 3 words I'm thinking of: fear, faith, and fanaticism, and the thin line between those. Because I think that a lot of us have been saying, well, who are these QAnon people, and why are they, they're screaming about there's a group of pedophiles trying to murder children. Isn't that interesting? And yeah. And I think that connecting faith to fanaticism is important idea for us to understand our world right now.
Right. And I think, people do want certainty.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, that's not how life is. So, faith is more complicated than just I'm clicking my heels and going forward. I'll add one more theologian. What's his name? Yitz Greenberg, Rabbi Yitz Greenberg. He's a modern Orthodox rabbi, and he's writing about after the Holocaust. Okay, let's say you have total faith in God, and then the Holocaust comes along. Where was God? And we talk about God intervening during the Exodus. Well, where was God during the Shoah? And he says that you can no longer have just, it's not about the depth of your faith, it's the frequency of your faith. How often can you have this faith? And can you explain your theology in front of the image of 1,000 burning children? Because he talks about this trial in Nuremberg where this one officer talks about the fact that eventually, because it was too expensive to first kill the babies, they just tossed them in the fire directly. And so how do you defend your theology in front of that? And there are times when you can't have faith. There are times you cannot have faith. I mean, this is his, so it's moment faith. It's like, how many moments can you feel faith? And frankly, living with some kind of ambiguity is just what life is all about. Maybe one day we'll understand it all. We'll end up, getting it. But until then, there's so much mystery there. And why it's picked for Rosh Hashanah is a big, fat question. I don't have the answer. People threw out some interesting answers. The rabbis didn't leave us notes to tell us why. The ram's horn, of course, is an obvious one, right? Because the shofar is from a ram's horn. But beyond that, I think some of your suggestions were very good ones. It's really not clear why. And actually, as I briefly mentioned, that's the reading for the second day of Rosh Hashanah. The first day is the story of how Hagar, who is Abraham's kind of first, she's not really his wife, but he does have a child with her. And so she's sort of a wife. Sarah and Abraham decide that she's too much trouble, and Abraham takes her out into the desert and leaves her there with Isaac to die. They don't die. It's a very similar story. Those are the two stories we read for Rosh Hashanah. I'm going to leave it at that for you. Yes, Ishmael is the kid. I'm going to change my background and we're going to go to something much happier because we're going to talk about Purim, which just ended. There we go. Okay. Purim, yippee. Okay, so Purim is a very, very happy holiday, taking us away from this very sad story of the Akedah. And I am going to share my screen. We are going to talk a little bit about Purim, and talk about the Book of Esther, and talk about some Purim traditions. So one of the important mitzvot, the mitzvah, is to read the scroll of Esther, which we're not going to read the scroll of Esther, but I'm going to give you a summary of the story, which we will then talk about. So the scroll of Esther, so there are Megillot. Megillah is a scroll, even though people say the whole Megillah, but it actually is a scroll. So it tells a story about Purim, and it is a mitzvah to read the whole story. And you're supposed to be cheerful, irreverent, and frivolous as you're reading it. Now, as you'll see, the story of Purim, things are kind of upside down. And so we're supposed to sort of spend the day being upside down. So for example, those of you who came to the service on Friday, we did the service backwards. That was not easy to figure out. As I explained, I'm not good at reversing directions, much less reversing the service. Okay, but anyway, we did do it. And, you're supposed, sometimes people will, if it's during the week and somebody's wearing their tefillin, these little boxes on your head kind of thing, people will wear them askew or whatever, the whole thing. You're supposed to, when you hear the name Haman, who's the prime minister, you're supposed to say boo, and you're supposed to have what's called a grogger, which is very loud noisemaker every time you hear the name Haman. So here are the mitzvot of Purim: hearing the Megillah, sending gifts to the poor, also sending gifts to family and friends, mishloach manot, and having a festive meal. So, for example, we put together some bags and brought them to some of our more shut-in congregants, with like a little bit of wine, some hamantaschen, which we'll mention in a second, and a few other things. So you send gifts, usually gifts of food, to friends. And actually, if you're too poor to do that, you're still supposed to send a gift. So what happens is one poor person sends to another poor person, and then they reverse. So you can still do the mitzvah, even, you're not going to be out a meal, but you'll switch meals with somebody else. Gifts to the poor, tzedakah. Hamantaschen are these triangular cookies. It means Haman's hat, because supposedly Haman had a triangular hat. We'll find out who Haman is in a moment. And the hamantaschen can have all kinds of good things in it. Here you see jam and chocolate and M&Ms. You can put just about anything in them: poppy seeds, prunes, whatever. And you're supposed to have a party. You're supposed to be joyous, and you're supposed to dress up. You're supposed to, wear a costume. Very often with kids, you have like a costume, party and competition to see who has the best costume. And you're supposed to be really, really, really happy.
Purim time is upon us. We'll be singing some crazy tunes. Yes, everything's topsy-turvy. I mean, we eat cookies filled with prune. Check it all in time. Work, 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 you gotta work your grogger right. Work, 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 you gotta work it all in time. Well, there was a guy named Haman. He tried to kill off the Jews, but thankfully brave Esther saved us. She knew what to do with no time to lose. She jumped in the line, put her mask on, drank some more. I believe you. Jump in the line, everything will be fine. I believe you. Jump in the line, put your mask on, drink some more. I believe you. Jump in the line, everything will be fine. As you shake, shake, shake your grogger right. Shake, shake, shake your grogger, shake it all in time. Work, work, work your grogger right. Work, work, work your grogger, work it all in time. Everyone's dressed up in costumes, we march around in parades. 'Cause us Jews, if you give us lemons, we'll make a lemonade. Jump in the line, put your mask on, drink some wine. I believe you. Jump in the line, everything will be fine. I believe you. Jump in the line, put your mask on, drink some wine. I believe you. Jump in the line, everything will be fine. As you shake, shake, shake your brother right. Shake, shake, shake your brother, shake it all in time. Work, work, work your brother right. Work, work, work your brother, work it all in time. The moral of this Megillah is stand up for what you feel. And if you try to kill us, we'll boo out your name and make a Purim spiel. Put your mask on, drink some. Okay, I believe you. Jump in the line, everything will be fine. Okay, I believe you. Jump in the line, put your mask on, drink some. Okay, I believe you. Jump in the line, everything will be fine. Okay, I believe you. work it all in time. Dance, dance, dance the horror. Dance it all in time. Work, work, work you brother. Work it all in time. Hey, jump in the line. Put your mask on, drink some more. I believe you. Jump in the line. Everything will be fine. I believe you. Jump in the line. Put your mask on, drink some more. I believe you. Jump in the line. Everything will be fine. I believe as you shake, shake, shake your brother. Shake your brother right. Shake, shake, shake your brother. Shake it all in time. Work, work, work your brother. Work your brother right. Work, work, work your brother. Work it all in time.
I like the mask, Bobby. Very nice. Another thing that you do for Purim is you are supposed to do a Purim spiel. And a Purim spiel is basically to tell the story of Purim, but in some other context. So for example, Star Wars, you know, Princess Leia could be Esther and, you know, whatever all the characters are. Or you can do something to make fun of people. Like when I was in seminary, we would do a Purim spiel, which would kind of, you know, poke fun at the teachers and at some of the things we were learning. So, as I said, everything's it's a little like Mardi Gras, and we'll talk about why we have something like that. Okay, there's some things in the chat. Why is everyone supposed to drink a lot of alcohol? We'll get to that. Happy Purim, thank you. Yes. All right. Okay, I'm going to start telling you the story of Esther. So in the this is the very beginning, the third year of his reign, this is King Ahasuerus, who is the king of Persia and kind of Persian Empire. He made a feast for all his princes and his servants, 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace, and royal wine in abundance. So King Ahasuerus, as we'll see, is a bit of a dunce, and he really, really loves partying. That's his thing. Likes to get drunk. And he's making a feast, and you see here, there are 7 days of eating and drinking a lot of wine. Now, his then wife, Vashti, is making a feast for the women in the royal house. So in other words, she's having her own party. And on the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded the 7 chamberlains that served in the presence of Ahasuerus, the king, to bring Vashti, the queen, before the king with the crown royal, to show the people and the princes her beauty, for she was fair to look on. So Ahasuerus, drunk, wants to show off his beautiful queen to his pals. And since it says she's supposed to show up with the crown, the rabbis say she was supposed to show up naked, but that's not in the story. It'll be relevant later, you'll see why. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command. Now this made the king very angry. Hey, I said come, and you're not coming. So he says to the wise men, what shall we do to Queen Vashti according to the law? So one of his people says, well, Vashti, the queen, has done wrong, not only to the king, but also to all the princes and to all the people that are in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For the queen's deed shall be known to all women, so they shall be emboldened to treat their husbands with disrespect, God forbid, right? They will say that King Ahasuerus commanded Vashti, the queen, to be brought before him, but she would not come. What do you do about a situation like that? Let a royal decree be issued by you, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, never to be revoked, that Vashti shall never again appear before the king, and let the king give her royal estate to another who is more worthy than she. And when the king's decree shall be published throughout all his empire, all the wives, both great and small, shall give honor to their husbands. Now, as my wonderful friend and Bible professor, Rabbi Dr. Tamar Eskenazi, said, this decree is actually counterproductive, Because by announcing that all women must obey their husbands and not follow Vashti's example, what are they doing? They're giving the women the idea that, hey, maybe I don't have to listen to my husband. So again, everything's topsy-turvy. Things don't make sense. I mean, this decree is like really dumb, but that's what they're going to do. They're going to go tell everybody in the whole land that Vashti wouldn't listen to the king and you need to listen to your husband. Well, what happens after this? The king got very lonely. I mean, he got rid of, this guy does not think ahead. There's certain people we could compare to him too. He's not a strategic thinker. He's not a long-term thinker. Right at the moment, he was pretty tired of her disobedience, so he got rid of her, but then, now I'm lonely. Okay. So he sends his attendants to search for the most beautiful virgins of the land. Many girls were brought to Susa, the capital, to the care of Haggai. Now, Esther is either the niece or the cousin of Mordecai. And Mordecai says, hey, you should go and try out for this. But don't tell the king that you're Jewish. We don't know why he says that because nowhere does it say there's any anti-Semitism, by the way. So Esther was taken to the palace. He supplied her with cosmetics, and the full period of preparation before a girl went to King Ahasuerus was 12 months. 6 months treatment with oil of myrrh and 6 months with perfumes and cosmetics. When it was Esther's turn, the girl whom Mordecai had adopted, the king loved her more than any other women and placed the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. So she pleased him. Who knows why exactly? She was pretty, and she's now the queen. Now, after these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman. What are you supposed to do when you hear the name Haman? Unmute and say boo.
Boo!
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 Ooh.
So this guy is the prime minister, basically. Of course, his hat does not exactly look like it's triangular, but whatever. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not bow down to him, so he just demanded everybody bow down to him. Mordecai wouldn't do it. And it's, by the way, not completely clear why. Because we don't bow down to idols, but who said we don't bow down to some royal figure or whatever? Nor showed him reverence. Haman was furious. So Haman goes from, this guy really annoys me. And who is he? Oh, he's a Jew. Well, that must mean all Jews are like him. A conclusion that, is not really warranted, but this is how prejudice works. Haman sought to destroy all the Jews that were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. Haman said to King Ahasuerus, there is a certain people scattered throughout all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from every other people. Neither do they keep the king's laws, and it does not befit the king to tolerate them. So Haman is saying, hey, we got to get rid of these people. Something's wrong. Now, what do you think good old king's going to do? Now, does he ask him any questions? Does he say, well, maybe we should investigate this before we do anything? No. Another decree. If it please the king, let an order be drawn up that they may be destroyed. And I will pay 10,000 talents of silver to be deposited in the royal treasury. This is Haman saying this. So here's a little extra money, to, seal the deal here. And the king took his ring from his hand and gave it to Haman. So he, king says, fine, go do whatever you want. And he's the son of an Agagite. And that's a whole other story, going back to King Saul, who was supposed to kill this king and didn't. And now his descendant is torturing the Jews. A writ was issued and sent by courier to all the king's provinces to destroy, to kill, and to exterminate all Jews, young and old, children and women, in one day, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is Adar. We're in Adar right now. And their goods were to be treated as spoil. In other words, you get to keep all their goods. When Mordecai heard all that was done, he rent his clothes and put on sackcloth with ashes. And that's what you do when someone dies. You put on sackcloth and ashes. So he's in mourning. And went out into the midst of the city and cried with a loud and a bitter cry. So Esther's maid and her chamberlains came and told her. Then the queen was greatly distraught. She sent clothing to Mordecai to take away his sackcloth from him. So in other words, ooh, I'm getting embarrassed. My uncle is out there being weird. I'm going to go give him some other clothes to wear. But he refused. And there's a lot of negotiations going on, but eventually Mordecai tells Esther's servants to charge her with going to the king to implore him and to beseech him for her people. So Mordecai says, no, there's something going on here and you need to do something. And she says, oh, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that whosoever, whether man or woman, shall come before the king into the inner court, who is not called, he or she will be put to death, except for the one whom the king hands a golden scepter. In other words, you can't just show up, in front of the king and say, here I am, I need to talk to you about something. No, the king has to summon you. And if you don't get summoned and you show up, then there's a good chance that the king's going to say, off with their head. So she says, I can't go in there. That's too scary. And Mordecai says, look, don't think that because you're in the royal palace, you alone of all the Jews shall escape. If you remain silent at such a time as this, then deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. In other words, just because you're a court Jew, which there have been many of, don't think you're safe. Once we're wiped out, you'll be part of that. You and your father's house will be destroyed. Maybe someone else will save us, but this is this important line. And who knows whether it is not for a time like this that you have become queen. Maybe this is the reason you're in the palace in the first place, to save us. So Esther, steps up to the challenge. She puts on her royal apparel and she stood in the inner court facing the palace. The king sat upon his royal throne in the palace. When the king saw Esther, the queen, standing in the court, she obtained his favor. In other words, she shows up. He doesn't say off with her head. He hands her the golden scepter. So Esther drew near and touched the top of the scepter. And the king says to her, what is it, Queen Esther? Whatever you request, up to half my kingdom, it shall be granted to you. In other words, this guy never thinks things through. If you want half my kingdom, you can have whatever you want. And she says, now, she's trying to save the Jews from Haman. What is it she's going to suggest they do? She knows how to speak to this guy. Let the king and Haman come this day to the banquet that I've prepared for him. In other words, let's have a party. That's how she knows she's going to get the king in a good mood. Let's have a party and do some drinking. There are actually two parties, but we'll skip the first one. So Haman is the only guy who's invited to the party. So he's thinking, whoa, I'm something really hot here because the king and queen have invited just me. Then at the banquet, the king says to Queen Esther, what do you want? You'll have it. And he says again, if you want me to give you half my kingdom, I'll do that. And she answers and says, if I found favor with your majesty, what I ask is that my own life and the lives of my people be spared. This is the first time she's telling him that she's Jewish. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, slain, and exterminated. King Ahasuerus demanded, who is he and where is he who has dared to do such a thing? And she says, a ruthless enemy, this wicked Haman. Uh-oh. And then they're trying to figure out what they're going to do with Haman. And one of the eunuchs says there's a gallows 75 feet high standing at Haman's house. So Haman built a gallows to hang Mordecai. Well, guess what's going to happen? He had erected it for Mordecai, whose evidence once saved your majesty. That's a whole other sort of side story. Let Haman be hanged on it, said the king. And before we go to this, so the gallows was raised by Haman to hang Mordecai, but Haman gets hung on it instead. And actually, the story about Mordecai saving the king is that one day he happens to hear that these guys are plotting against the king, and he goes and reports that to the palace. And one night when the king can't sleep, he's reading his journal and he realizes somebody saved his life and he never did anything to reward him. So the next day he says to Haman, hey, if you wanted to really honor somebody, what would you do? And Haman says, I would thinking, of course, he's going to be honored himself, I would parade this person around on a horse and say, this is the person the king honors. And the king goes, great, do that for Mordecai. So you see, everything keeps getting put on its head and reversed. And of course, at the end of the story, first of all, Mordecai becomes the prime minister. And the Jews, of course, the decree went out for the Jews to be killed. And you cannot pull a decree back. Once it's out there, it's out there. So all you can do is send out another decree. So the decree that the king sends out is one that says the Jews can defend themselves. Now, mostly when the story is told, the ending is not included. It's not a fun thing to tell people, and certainly not kids who, this is sort of a kids' holiday. But the Jews end up killing 75,000 people. So they didn't really have to. So it's not really the most happy ending. I mean, the Jews do get saved, but they also kill a lot of people. And again, they don't absolutely have to kill all these people. So another reversal. And so I'm going to share this slide because someone asked about this. On Purim, a person must drink until he or she cannot tell the difference between cursed be Haman and blessed be Mordecai. We're going to take a break in a moment. I want you to think about that. And when we come back, I'd like to talk about it. What does it mean to get so drunk that you can't tell the difference between Haman and Mordecai? A few people here were at our service on Friday, and we did discuss it. But I'd like you to think about that. What does that mean? Why do we do that? Why would we do that? Why do we have a holiday where we get so drunk that we can't tell the difference? So it's 1:57. Let's come back at 2:10. I'm giving you 13 minutes. Okay? And come back maybe with some answers. And as you know, there probably aren't any real solid answers, but that's okay. Welcome back. For those of you who are watching the recording, I need to apologize. I forgot to record the second half of the class, so I am recreating it now. Unfortunately, you will not be privy to all the wonderful discussions that we had. I will try to summarize them, but I will not be able to do justice to the students who just really contributed so beautifully today. But in any event, we'll cover the main points. So before the break, we were talking about the fact that on Purim, a person must drink until he or she cannot tell the difference between cursed be Haman and blessed be Mordecai. What is that all about? And we shared different ideas, like that sometimes you need to know the bad in order to know the good. Sometimes you need to know that evil and good are on a continuum, and they aren't necessarily as different as we might think. We know that there are people who are good, who can do really evil things. We know people who are considered evil, who can do really wonderful things. So it's not as clear-cut as one might think. We might also question, for example, Mordecai. How good a guy was he? Well, let's start with the fact that, as one of my students said, he pimped out his niece, right? In order to have somebody in the palace, one presumes, he asked her to go and compete to be the queen. And what if she hadn't been queen? She might very well have been a member of the harem, which meant that she would have been there for whenever the king felt like sleeping with her. She wouldn't have had much of another role. And so one has to wonder, did Mordecai actually plan this whole thing? Because in the end, Mordecai becomes the prime minister instead of Haman. Was that the plan from the beginning? Is that why he wouldn't bow down to Haman? We're not sure. I just want to put a little seed of doubt there, just in case. So we'll continue. So this is an analysis of why we have a holiday like Purim. So Leviticus follows the account of the completion of the Mishkan, the tabernacle, the symbol of God's dwelling amidst the people. Now that God's presence is in their midst, now you remember that when the tabernacle was being built, God said, I will dwell there among you. So the real challenge begins to safeguard God's dwelling amongst the Israelites. In other words, we have to figure out how to make sure God doesn't leave us. We've gotten God on our property now, in our tabernacle, and we want to make sure that that remains the case. Acting according to the laws given in Exodus will assure the presence of God among the people. Transgression and wayward behavior will distance the people from God and God from the people. Ritual pollution could potentially build up to a point such that God's presence could no longer tolerate dwelling in the people's midst. So ritual purity is really important to those who wrote Leviticus, which are a group of priests. And ritual pollution is not about being dirty. It's about being ritually impure. Unfortunately, they consider a woman menstruating as being ritually impure, but that has nothing to do with dirty or not dirty. It has to do with being in a certain condition, both yourself personally and the camp and the whole community, that is appropriate for God to remain within our midst. So God says, if you don't maintain the ritual purity, not only will I not be present, but you are going to be kicked out of the land. Everett Fox comments, Fox comments, Leviticus is largely concerned with the potential disruption of this utopia, and so concentrates on threats to Israel's life with God. The systems described in Leviticus are methodical and systematic. Order preserves order, for it is through the detail of ritual sacrifice that one ensures the continuing relationship between God and the Israelites. So follow the rules, do everything exactly according to plan, and everything will be okay. We will preserve this utopia, so to speak. But in contrast, Megillat Esther, the scroll of Esther, and the celebration of Purim convey a sense of disorder and chaos. The very words Purim and Esther suggest a lack of order. Purim, as the third chapter of the Megillah mentions, means lots, therefore random selection. So when Haman decided that the Jews needed to be destroyed, Haman had a bunch of lots thrown out to decide what the right day would be to do this. So it's a random day, in addition to everything else in the story being topsy-turvy. The rabbis relate the Persian names Esther to the Hebrew for Esther, which means hidden. So God is hidden in this story. We never see God. The last time we actually see God in the Bible is in the book of Job. And after that, we never see God again. That's in the Hebrew Bible in any event. In the Megillah, the tables are turned and the world is flipped upside down. Esther replaces Queen Vashti and conceals her Jewish identity in order to marry the king. That guy's name is Ahasuerus. Excessive feasting and drinking form the refrain of the tale. Haman's plans for annihilating the Jewish people are foiled. The Jews take revenge on those who had sought to do them harm, and the non-Jews seek to become Jews. In other words, since the Jews are giving permission at the very end of the story to protect themselves and really even to take revenge, people who aren't Jewish claim they're Jewish so that they won't be killed. That's a complete reversal of what normally goes on. So I'd like to explore a little bit what it means to have this chaotic day, this day of things being upside down. I think part of it is a need to release any kind of frustration, any kind of anger, any kind of rebellion against following all the rules, that one day it's okay not to follow the rules, to go a little bit crazy, to drink a lot, to wear a costume and be in disguise. So on the one hand, I think it's a great way to release all of that. And I think many cultures have a day like this, like Mardi Gras or Halloween. I think the other reason, though, is that by throwing everything upside down on its head and reversing everything that we normally think of as a stable world, it makes us question that stable world. Are things the way they should be? Maybe if we throw them upside down, we'll rethink things. Like in this story, the men are kind of dumb, right? Especially the king. The king just has parties. He hands over his signet ring so that Haman can issue a decree to kill people he doesn't even know anything about. He offers Esther half his kingdom, if that's what she feels like having. So he's not too bright. He's not too thoughtful, but the women are thoughtful. Gee, that's really different from what we normally think of women in the Bible, although there are plenty of really smart women in the Bible. But this reverses who's really in charge. We see Esther really has a lot of power, and Vashti does too in her own way. And sometimes we need to be in that really confusing upside down place to rethink, to open up our minds. The Torah is given in the wilderness because when we're in the wilderness, we let go of all our assumptions, all our comforts, and we're open to something new and different. And I think it serves that purpose as well. What else do we learn from this story? So the focus of the book of Esther is on the people of Israel, not on God. As I said, God is not in this story. Its purpose is to teach active political responsibility, not passive faith in divine providence. Salvation depends mainly on the Jews themselves and the readiness of their highly placed brethren to take charge of their fate. The allusions to God's name and his intervention that generations of commentators have forced into the text obscure the author's real intention to teach us through the inner development of the characters that we Jews are responsible for our own fate as we are responsible for one another. Mordecai makes a mistake in not bowing down to Haman. The book of Esther does not explain why he refuses to bow, and the commentators have never managed to come up with an explicit religious prohibition against bowing to a human being. The storyline lends itself to only one interpretation. Mordecai misjudges his position in the court. Out of sheer self-satisfaction and self-importance, he imagines that he is above the law, requiring all courtiers to show Haman deference. So there are two issues here. One is, we are not meant to just sit passively and wait for God to save us. Remember, when Moses is wandering through the desert with his sheep and he notices the burning bush, he notices that it is not being consumed because he takes the time to do that, and he gets off the track and goes to look at the bush. And that's when God speaks to him. We have to take a step. When the Israelites have escaped from Egypt and slavery and get to the Sea of Reeds with the Egyptian army behind them trying to catch them and the sea in front of them, Moses looks up to God and says, God, what should I do? And God says, don't ask me, you do something. And then Nachshon in the Midrash, one of the members of the tribe of Judah, decides to go into the water, and it's only when the water gets up to his nose that the sea finally parts. We are in partnership with God. We are not to sit passively by and hope that God will save us. We must save ourselves with God's support, with our faith in God, with the strength that God gives us. Another story I like to tell is sort of a joke that, let's say during Katrina in New Orleans, a man is on his roof because the water's gotten way up on his house. Somebody comes by with a rowboat and says, hop in, I'll save you. The man says, no, I'm waiting for God to save me. Then someone else comes with a helicopter. Come on up, we'll save you. No, says the man, I'm waiting for God to save me. And then someone else comes with some other method of saving him. And he says, no, I'm waiting for God. When he gets up to heaven, because he dies, obviously, he says to God, well, where were you? I was waiting for you to save me. God says, I sent you a rowboat. I sent you a helicopter. I sent you whatever the other vehicle was. Why didn't you Get on. And one more example, Che had mentioned Black churches before. And I saw a program with Dr. Fauci doing a conference with a number of Black clergy members from, I think it was Boston, trying to convince them to get them to talk to their congregants about getting the vaccine. And one of the clergy members said, that's what I tell my congregants. When they say to me, I'm protected because God is here, or I believe in Jesus and Jesus will protect me, she says to them, you know what? The doctors and the scientists who discovered the vaccine are God's hands. And that's where you need to go to get your protection. The other lesson here is a complicated one about Mordecai. So Mordecai, why doesn't he bow down to Haman? It really is not because it's idolatrous. It's not idolatrous to bow down to somebody. It's idolatrous to bow down to an idol. Now, either Mordecai figures, I'm important enough, I'm the uncle of the queen, so I don't need to bow down to him. Or he's trying to provoke Haman. Provoke him so that maybe he can end up taking Haman's job. So there's a whole bunch of stuff to learn from that. Don't assume that your position is more important than it is. And by the way, this whole problem would not have even happened in the first place if Mordecai had bowed down to this man, if he hadn't been so, let's say, prideful. There wouldn't have been a pogrom directed against the Jews. So in a sense, Mordecai caused the whole thing in the first place. In any event, he does prevail upon his niece to do something about it, and she does very courageously. All right, we'll go on. Now, we're going to look at how the rabbis, just very briefly, understand Esther and Vashti. They love Esther. Why? She's the ideal woman. She's beautiful. She's obedient. She's faithful to God, and she's courageous in the face of life-threatening danger. On the other hand, Vashti, a pagan queen, is seen as the incarnation of evil and faithlessness. Well, she's not Jewish, so that's all you need to know, and the rabbis don't like her. They assume that because the text says she's supposed to appear with her crown, that her husband wants her to appear naked, wearing only a crown. And so from that, they deduce that the reason she didn't show up is because all of a sudden she had leprosy, and she did not want to come out and be embarrassed and humiliated because of leprosy. It's a little fanciful, but it works. Now I want to look at some feminist writers. Some of them really, really do not like Esther. Not long ago, a Jewish friend bemoaned her daughter's delight in dressing up as Esther for the children's annual Purim celebration. I tell her, don't be Esther, be Vashti. I want her to be strong and independent, not passive and compliant. And this is another one. Esther, for the chance of winning wealth and power, takes her place in the herd of maidens who become concubines of the king. She wins her victories not by skill or by character, but by her beauty. She conceals her origin, is relentless toward a fallen enemy, secures not merely that the Jews escape from danger, but that they fall upon their enemies, slay their wives and children, and plunder their property. So Esther's being blamed for that final pogrom against the non-Jews because that's something she urges the king to do. Buried in Esther's character is full compliance with patriarchy. In contrast to Vashti, who refused to be men's sexual object and her husband's toy, Esther is the stereotypical woman in a man's world. She wins favor by the physical beauty of her appearance and then by her ability to satisfy sexually. She concentrates on pleasing those in power, that is, men. And this is a pretty traditional critique of women who've made it in the world, that they, so-called slept their way to the top or something of that ilk. Sometimes that's something that some women have had no choice about, but it's not necessarily the case that a woman makes it because of that. Then by contrast, Vashti's story, meant to be a warning against saying such a no, has just the opposite effect from what was intended. It gives me an invitation to say no when my body is about to be violated. I feel proud of Vashti's refusal. I love her reckless strength. And this is another take on Vashti. Vashti's banishment is not because of her disobedience, but because of the potential effects of her disobedience. If Vashti were not punished, her decision could be the start of a major revolution. Other women might look to her as their model. Her example would then empower them to rebel against the domination of their husbands. She was cast off because she was an enormous threat to the patriarchal status quo. Now, this is actually a slightly more positive view of Esther. Her conduct throughout the story has been a masterpiece of feminine skill. From beginning to end, she does not make a misstep. She is a model for the successful conduct of life in the diaspora. By accepting the reality of a subordinate position and learning to gain power by working within the structure rather than against it. So Esther is very savvy. She knows exactly how to appeal to her king, her husband. Offer him a party, get him drunk. Then he'll be perfectly willing to do anything you want. And how do you get to Haman? You make him think that he's a special guy. He has absolutely no idea that Esther is going to denounce him. He just thinks, I am a special guy. I get to be invited to a private party by the king and the queen. And therefore, he's enticed to come to the party and to be denounced and then eventually hung on the Mordecai gallows. So she's very savvy. And the discussion that we had was about whether it's better to operate like Vashti from the outside and basically take a radical stance, or whether it's better to play the game from within the system. I mentioned that somebody that I think is similar to Esther in some ways is Nancy Pelosi. Nancy Pelosi is quite liberal. She's been in politics for a very, very long time. And somehow she knows how to navigate the system to the point where she's been Speaker of the House several times. Not an easy thing for somebody who's quite liberal from California when Congress is not particularly liberal and neither is this country. So she learned how to maneuver from the inside and get things done that way. The conclusion of our discussion was that both are important. Sometimes you need to attack from the outside. Sometimes you need to work from the inside. And it depends in some ways on the circumstances. And I suppose as well on the person, because there are people who are much more comfortable being radical and people much more comfortable working on an incremental level. So in conclusion to our class on Purim and to the beginning of our class talking about the binding of Isaac, I really, really want to encourage all of you to think about all these stories critically. Let's not just accept Mordecai's the good guy and Haman's the bad guy. Maybe it's the other way around. I don't think Haman's so great, but maybe Mordecai's not such a good guy. And maybe Vashti isn't such a terrible woman. And things are not always as they seem, which is why we wear disguises on Purim and we take on different roles to think about what might it be like if I were a queen with power? What might it be like if I were a villain like Haman with a triangular hat on? Maybe I'm going to discover something about myself that I didn't even know was there. The wilderness is where we got the Torah, because that's where assumptions are set aside. That's where comfort is set aside. Purim is a day of discomfort, actually, because do we like chaos? No. We may like a day of chaos, but we certainly don't like a life of chaos. We like things to be orderly, just like the Israelites in the desert, following the rules of Leviticus. But sometimes we need to throw everything up in the air and rethink. If we think about gender, for example, people from my generation were taught to think there were two genders, female and male. Yes, there were some people who were gay and there were people who were trans, but non-binary, no. So being brought up that way, there are grooves that are set in your brain. And how do you undo those grooves to be open to another way of looking at the world, to another way of understanding gender? You have to really maybe get drunk, although not all of us can get drunk. I don't drink, I can't drink. So I must find another way to do that. Maybe take a break and go off into the desert myself. Maybe meditate. There are a number of ways that we can do that. But I think periodically we need to do that. We need to throw everything up and rethink everything that we know. So thank you for joining me and thank you for joining the class. And we will see you next week. Goodbye.